So I hope this is working. Is this working? Okay. Hi everyone. Okay, great. And I see your comment there. I guess, will I be able to hear anyone else, or it'll just be my audio and you guys will be typing? Okay. Well, I guess, would you like me to get started then? Okay. Present. Okay. I don't know why it's not doing present mode. There we go. So are you guys seeing presentation? Okay. So welcome to, sorry for the technical difficulties. This is my first time doing a Facebook webinar. My topic they asked me to do was language revitalization, languageness, and funding. Are you guys seeing the slides? Yeah, I hope you are. Okay. So Jenny So did a workshop on language revitalization the last semester, and this will be another one. So I won't go over some of the basics that she went over, and her talk recording and slides are still available for those who would like to see hers. This is a picture of the Mohawk language nests in upstate New York. And I'd like to thank Anna Ballou and Shirley Gabber for organizing this language documentation training center session and for inviting me to speak to you guys. I would like to recognize that I'm giving this talk from the island of Hawai'i, and that it is the land of the Kanaka Maoli, the native Hawaiian people, and that Olelo Hawai'i, the language of the Hawaiian people, is the language of this land. Okay, great. I'm glad you guys can see it. So there is an olelo no eau, a proverb in Hawaiian that goes, Ika olelo no ke ola, Ika olelo no kamake. And it means in language there is life, and in language there is death. This can be interpreted in many ways, and one way it's interpreted is that the life of the culture is inherently intertwined with language. Another way it's been interpreted is that words can give people life, can build people up, and they can also break people down. And the words we say about people's languages can also do the same. Now, before I get started into the whole talk, this was advertised as talk about language revitalization, languageness, and funding. And I did want to give a disclaimer that different geographic areas of the world have different types of organizations to which they're able to apply for funding. And so I apologize ahead of time if I'm not familiar with the specific organizations in your geographic region. I hope you can still get something out of this. And I just didn't want to overpromise, but hopefully we can share some knowledge from other programs. I also wanted to say that wherever you are, whoever you are, your language matters. And if you have a desire to start a language nest or a language revitalization program, if you feel it, that this is something you want to do to preserve your heritage and your language, you can do it. It's possible. And there is an entire global network of people who are doing the same thing and people who have been successful at it. So you're not alone, and there will be help. I also wanted to say, I saw this meme recently and it seemed fitting. If you ever feel like you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping in a room with a single mosquito. So as we talk about different language revitalization efforts and the history of them and the impact each seemingly small effort made, perhaps you will have more confidence that you can also do it. One other thing I wanted to note was that this quote that I've also heard: the gates of history swing on small hinges. And I want you to think about that as we're talking about the logistics and the practical. But I truly believe if you have a will, there will be a way, and that everything is figure outable. So that the most important part of all is just the motivation. So this is not too original. The outline of the talk is basically the title. I'll be discussing a little bit about language revitalization, then go into depth about language nests, and then funding. And this is a picture of my wonderful Mohawk friends at the Akwesasne Freedom School. They let me use their pictures. Okay. So first of all, language endangerment, I'm just going to go over briefly, is typically caused by language shift. And I do acknowledge the recent discussions about the term endangered language being a misnomer in some cases, that really we should be saying oppressed languages, because in many, many cases, languages were forcibly removed from people. There was active oppression. So this is not necessarily a passive thing of languages becoming endangered. Sometimes there were actual laws prohibiting a language being spoken or taught, or people were even violently punished for speaking their language. So language shift, though, is pretty much the most common way language endangerment happens, and language shift sometimes has those active oppressive acts within it. But it's defined as when a language is spoken by fewer and fewer people in fewer and fewer domains until it is spoken by no one at all. So language revitalization is addressing those two things, increasing the number of speakers and increasing the domains in which the language is used. And most of you are probably familiar with this, but for those who are not, a language domain is a social sphere in which a language is used. So for example, in schools, in the home, in business, in the media, in churches, with children on the playground. All of these social spaces are spaces in which a language can be used. And the greater number of domains in which a language is used, and the greater number of people who speak the language, the more vital or secure the language vitality status is. Language endangerment is measured by many factors. The absolute number of speakers, how many people speak the language, which domains it's used in. But the most important, the factor that's weighted the most is intergenerational transmission, whether the language is being transmitted to the next generation. You could have 1 million people who speak the language, but if it's not being passed on to the next generation, within a generation, the language will be gone. So language nests, which I'll be talking about, address this most significant factor of endangerment, intergenerational transmission, creating a new generation of language speakers. Jenny had already talked about the different methods of language revitalization, so I won't go into the rest of these since to save on time. But yes, immersion schools, language classes, and we'll talk a little bit about how language nests relate to some of these other methods. What is a language nest? It's a method of language revitalization. It's an early childhood total immersion program, exclusively using the traditional language as the vehicle for interaction and instruction. This is one definition by King, and we will discuss kind of the history of language nests, how the name came to be, and what are some different ways people use the term. So language nests, actually it is believed the first structure of a language nest were for Samoan speakers in New Zealand. So in the 70s, it is believed Samoan families who had moved from Samoa to New Zealand, Aotearoa, wanted their children to still be able to speak Samoan. So they would gather their children and have someone who was fluent, maybe an elder, who could speak Samoan fluently, watch the children so that they could still be exposed to the language, although they were in a different country. Then Maori people saw that pattern and realized they could do that for the Maori language in situ without being diaspora. Because in these endangered language situations, people become, in a sense, linguistic diaspora in their own homeland, if that makes sense. Diaspora meaning you're away from your home or your people. But when you are an indigenous person with language intrusion from other languages, and a different language becomes the dominant language of the area, it can start to feel like your own indigenous language in your own land starts to feel like an outsider, which should never have to be the case, right? One Hawaiian friend explained it to me that, if you want to learn Spanish or French, you can study it and then travel to the country or place where everyone speaks it fluently. But he doesn't have that option as much. There are people now, Hawaiian is being revitalized, but there isn't an entire kingdom anymore where everyone there speaks it fluently for easy total immersion in all domains, right? Which is something we're working towards. So in 1982, the first Maori language nest was started for the purpose of language revitalization. And Te Kohangareo is the Maori term that literally means nest, the nest of language, so language nest. Then 2 years later, in 1984, Ahapunanaleo, the first official Hawaiian language nest, began, and it's cognate. It also means a nest of language, and that began in Hawaii. Okay, so although I want this to be relevant and applicable to all regions globally and to all languages and cultures, I'm going to just use Hawaiian as an example since I am from Hawaii and this is the case I'm most familiar with, and something similar can happen in other places. So although I said the first official Hawaiian language nest began in 1984, in 1983, the first unofficial group of babies was gathered. The babies didn't gather themselves, but adults decided they wanted their babies to be exposed to the Hawaiian language in an immersion context. They had no funding, there was no organization. They just gathered a bunch of infants together in a home, and they had some of the kupuna, or an elder who could speak the language fluently, watch these few babies. So Larry Kimura told me about this in personal communication. He's known for language revitalization in Hawaii. And he said in the beginning, they had no funding. So I want you to remember this. Some of your programs might be very advanced and have lots of funding and established institutions. But if you don't be discouraged. Hawaiian language revitalization started in someone's home with a kupuna, an elder, volunteering. So the gates of history swing on small hinges. Remember this. So this became so popular that more and more people wanted to bring their children until it was too much for one elder to watch all these babies without any backing. So in 1984, a year later, they began their first official Hawaiian language nest under the term Ahapunanaleo. Now I believe there are about 16 or 18 around the state, all under the same umbrella organization. We'll focus on the timeline now and we'll talk more about funding later. But in 1986, so 2 years later after the first official one, 3 years after the first unofficial one, Ahapunanaleo as an organization worked with the Hawaii state government to repeal the legal bans on the Hawaiian language. So there were actual laws banning Hawaiian language from being taught or used as a medium of instruction in public schools. And children were punished or mocked for it even. So it started with a volunteer. 3 years later, they worked to change the state laws. This also goes to show that you don't have to wait for higher organizational changes to start grassroots movements, and that sometimes it can happen in the reverse, where the grassroots movements then move the larger official changes. Just a year after that, Aha Punana worked with the Hawaii state government to establish curriculum for the very first indigenous language immersion schools in the US, which were Hawaiian language immersion schools. Up until recently, I hadn't realized that these were the first indigenous immersion language schools in the US. Please correct me if I'm wrong, if somebody finds out other information, but this is what I've read so far. Then 3 years after that, the President of the United States signed a Native American Language Act to preserve about 200 indigenous languages. And this was instigated by several Native American groups along with Aha Punana. So many different organizations from many cultures and languages working together to push for this change. Then later on, Hawaiian began their immersion schools. And now you can go from being a toddler or an infant in a language nest through all of your schooling through a doctoral program completely in Native Hawaiian. This is also true of Maori in New Zealand and the indigenous Sami language in Finland. And I want to emphasize that these programs all started, so in relation to language revitalization in general, in the context of language revitalization, language nests often, at least in my study, perhaps I'm biased because that was the avenue I was researching from, but these larger movements often started with a single language nest. And then when the children graduated from the language nest, like turned 5 years old, the parents and the teachers didn't want to lose the progress they made by sending them to a dominant language school for kindergarten or for grade school. So they would start the first immersion class in the language. And then that first graduating class became the first class of every year. And so they added a new year of immersion schooling until the students graduated. Then after that, they developed college programs, immersion college programs, then immersion graduate school programs. So it takes a few years sometimes, but it often starts with a language nest. The Administration of Native Americans has their own definition of language nest. The legal definition, it's a site-based educational program, provides native language instruction and child care through the use of a Native American language for at least 10 children under the age of 7, for an average of at least 500 hours per year per student. They provide language classes for the parents of the students enrolled, and it must be the target language, the indigenous language must be the dominant medium of instruction for the language nest. This recently was updated, I believe in 2019, through a new act. So now it's at least 5 children. So you don't need as many children for it to qualify as a language nest. And the number 500 hours is somewhat arbitrary. It is not based on any empirical research on language acquisition. However, I will mention later on through the study any correlations we found between the number of hours the language nest operated and the fluency of the children. Oh, and this law, this is if one is applying for funding for the language nest from the federal government in the United States. As a language nest, the program must meet all of these requirements in order to get funding. So, let's see. The First Peoples Cultural Council in British Columbia, Canada, also has a definition of a language nest. And they have a wonderful document online. It's available for free online as a PDF. Here's the link here. I'll give my slides to Anna and Shirley afterwards, so you guys can use these links. It's a whole handbook you could print out even on language nests. And they've developed training programs for people to have the most effective language nests possible. So the First Peoples Cultural Council definition for languageness, the children can be from newborns to 5 years old, immersed in their First Nations language. And it provides a safe home-like environment for the young children to interact with fluent speakers of the language, often elders, through meaningful activities. The goal of the languageness is not to teach children the language, but rather to create an environment where language can be acquired naturally. As infants acquire their first language, it may be useful to think of a languageness as granny's house, where children are cared for in a traditional cultural way in the language. So I really like what this definition brings to the table. It's saying you do not have to assimilate the way in which you operate or educate children. It doesn't have to become westernized. You can use the traditional methods and just practice the culture and live and be, and the children, and just do it all in the language, and the children naturally learn it. So they're acquiring it rather than being taught it. Some language nests I've been exposed to operate differently, and they definitely have a very strict curriculum, protocol. They kind of operate like a classroom. So there's a wide range of what a language nest can be, and you can make it whatever you want it to be. I'd also like to reiterate that what Anna was saying, or Shirley, if anyone has questions, please feel free to interject at any time. I'd be happy to answer them when you ask them, or if it fits later on, but please don't hesitate to interject any comments, questions, thoughts. So if there isn't only one way to run a language nest, this is one way. This is kind of the original idea, a home-like environment. And I've also seen ones that are very structured. And as I visited different language nests, one of the questions some language nests had was, how do you develop curriculum, or how do you schedule the time? You have all these children, what do you do with them in that time? And so for those that struggled with that, there were other language nests I spoke with who would start each morning with a routine. They would sing a song in the native language. They would do a chant all together, the children would. They would say, one of the Hawaiian language nests I visited did this. They would say a prayer in the native language. And then the children would take turns, one each day or one each week would have their turn to be the leader, and they would go through charts and point at the charts and talk about the weather for the day in the language. And they would talk about their emotions, how everyone in the room was feeling that day in the language. And it was great because they'd have one of the children, one of the older children, maybe one of the 4-year-olds, lead the conversation. So the other children could see their peers as an example. Either I'm explaining, it's a lot of viewers, but no questions so far. Either I'm explaining it well, or it's so confusing, or not interesting enough to ask a question about. But I'm glad you guys are here. Thank you all who are viewing this. So again, yeah, so there are ideas for those who want a more structured version, and there are language nests who have figured out those types of systems. So if you're struggling with that, I can point you to resources and other language nest directors and teachers. I'm not trying to self-promote at all, because I'm actually embarrassed about my writing quality in my dissertation, but my dissertation also includes that kind of useful information, not from me, but from other language nest experts, workers. So I myself am just a learner from those who actually work in language nests. Okay, so in my research, these were some of my questions. What is the state of language nests in the world? How many are there? What range exists? How is the term used? We talked a little bit about how you can have a home-like environment, or it could be very structured, almost like a preschool, where not only did they have a morning routine, but they'd also have crafts and activities, and cutting paper and making crafts or drawing pictures, all being explained by the teacher in the language, and the children expressing what they needed and wanted and what they were doing in the language. I also asked people about factors that led to success and challenges they faced, and what advice the ones at language nests that are operating, what they would advise to others who would like to start one or who are struggling and are just starting out. So I conducted 15 interviews. I won't discuss the acquisition part, and here's a reindeer from Finland in Inari-Sami language areas. These were 15 interviews I did. Some language nests preferred to remain anonymous, and others were fine being mentioned by name. And here is one of the language nest teacher's husbands. He's Sami, Inari-Sami, and he makes traditional Inari-Sami crafts. So I did 7 live in-person visits. The rest of the interviews were over phone or video. And these were the interview questions I had. I'm going to kind of go through these so we have more time to talk about other things. But some language nests, it was interesting, had other languages spoken there. So one of the Hawaiian language nests, Ahapunana Leo o Manoa, which is right across the street from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the teacher said, the kumu, the teacher said that some of the children were multilingual. One student spoke Japanese in addition to English and Hawaiian. One also spoke Samoan in their home. So the number of language nest teachers, typical ratio of children to adults, the background of teachers. So not all teachers were elders who were native fluent speakers. Many of them were younger people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Yes, we'll call those in their 50s younger people as well, who learned the language as a second language, either through a master apprentice program, which Jenny had talked about in the last revitalization workshop, or who went to immersion schools themselves. So you see a lot of these people who go through a language nest and immersion school end up becoming a language nest teacher and teaching the next generation. And I looked at the total of how many children were in language nests. Also looked at the age range that different language nests would accept, how many children were enrolled, what languages used most of the time. So this is one thing I did find. Everyone is trying their best. This is a very challenging situation, right? There are some language nests that do use the target indigenous language as the primary medium of instruction almost all the time or all the time. And of course, that's the ideal. Not all of us are able to do that either because of difficulty in finding fluent speakers to be teachers. Sometimes there are no fluent speakers available, and so we're doing the best we can with adults who are trying to learn the language as a second language but aren't yet fluent. And that's okay, you know, everyone's doing what they can with the resources available. There are some institutions that are called language nests, and that is the goal, but perhaps 90% of the communications, and these weren't any of the interviews I did, just for the record, none of these ones named here are like this. Those were all immersion programs. But I did come across others that were doing the best they could. 90% of the instruction was still in English, although it was maybe 95%, although it was a language nest and was trying to, reach a higher fluency goal. I see there's a comment here from Ellen. I work with speakers of indigenous languages of Mexico on a teacher development course for indigenous languages. Oh, that's wonderful. There was a language nest project at some point, but they have been discontinued. I am convinced that it is an excellent revitalization strategy. Wonderful, Ellen. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Yes, actually, I wanted to interview, I believe there was a Mixtec language nest or something in Oaxaca. And at the time I was doing my dissertation in around 2016, I made some emails and phone calls and found out that that language nest had stopped operating because of civil unrest. At the time, buses were being burned and the government was coming through. So it wasn't a stable situation for LanguageNets, but I agree with you. It's an excellent revitalization strategy. I'm not sure if you've been all on the call the whole time or the webinar, but in the beginning we talked about how in some of the most established revitalization situations with Hawaiian, Maori, and Sami, a lot of them started with either a single or a handful of language master apprentice programs or a language nest. And then from there, everything else developed. So yeah, I completely support any goals you have to reestablish a language nest in Mexico. Let's see. And thank you for your comment. Anyone else have any comments or questions at any time, please feel free to add them. I asked them about how much it costs to run it and if the parents or any relatives were able to speak the language in the home, the parents of the children or their grandparents. Things that helped the languages be successful, what their goals were. Lots of questions here. How many hours or days per week the children were there. Anything else they thought would be helpful, etc. Okay. So, oh yeah, this is in an aquasasane, the Canadian goose, which is very similar to, I believe the Hawaiian nene goose is a relative of the Canadian goose. This is a really teeny tiny table. I apologize about the size, but later with the slides you can zoom in with some of the results of the in-person interviews and video interviews. I left them anonymous, but the age ranges, some accepted children as young as a year-old or 8 to 9 months. Others, the youngest they would take was 4 years old. Teacher fluency. So all of these had fluent teachers. Here I put L1 if it's their first language, L2 if the target indigenous language is their second language. Oh yes, great. Yes, please contact me, any of you after this, if you are interested. So in these cases, there was only one, and sometimes they had an there'd be fluent second language teachers, and they would have an elder who spoke the language as their first language come in sometimes to help. And one of the challenges, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but since it's coming up with the teacher background, one of the challenges in establishing a language nest was finding qualified teachers. And people explained sometimes it's hard enough to even find someone who's fluent in the language, right? And then sometimes the only people who are fluent in the language were in their 70s or older, and they might not have the energy to spend all day, every day with a bunch of toddlers. Have any of you watched several 3 to 4-year-olds, 2 to 4-year-olds at once alone, or even with one other person? Imagine trying to do that all day, every day, while trying to transmit an indigenous language. So not only finding fluent speakers, but people who had the energy to play with children all day, and people who had the desire to be a language nest teacher. Not everyone wanted to spend time with little children. So there were many challenges in that sense. And those who wanted to spend time with children might not be as strong in the language. So you have two very different skill sets that need to be combined for this. And sometimes perhaps another solution is if there aren't enough individuals with both skill sets to combine different people with either skill set. The thing is, you just don't want too much of some other language infiltrating in the language list. So going back to the chart here, how many hours per week it met? The most was this one, had 45 hours a week, all day, every day. I think they met, let's see, all year as well. This is how many weeks per year. And those poor language nest teachers were exhausted. They did tell me that. So other ones met for 7 hours a week here. This was a pilot program, and they were planning to increase their number of hours in the following year. Some of them meet during the months that match the school year. So September to June or July. And let's see. This is what percent of the children in the language nest had language support in their home. Many of these cases we didn't know. In some cases, only 9% of them had it. In some cases, 70% of the children had language support in the home. This is the percent that the target language, the indigenous language, was used in the language nest for different activities. So we can say it's a total immersion program, right? But what this was as reported by teachers and instructors and directors. I'm seeing other comments here. Did they feel that it was better to get funding from state government or federal government, or to go without it when starting a language nest? Great question. You know, I didn't hear anyone express an opinion one way or the other if it was better to get funding from one organization or another. Basically, people are happy to get funding with whoever will give them funding, right? I will address this more, though. We'll talk about funding, if you don't mind, a little later in the presentation. But I will discuss about going without funding versus getting funding and different strategies for that. So thanks, is that Melvi? Thank you for that question. And again, it also depends on what state or country you're in, right? What organizations are available to you. Let's see, I will also mention some other funding strategies that are from not from the government. I was told, Lisa says, I was told that it should be made a point to try and get the children to interact with each other more in the language, since they have the possibility to grow up together, especially in smaller language communities, and just reduplicating a Western school setting and using a target language, let's see, is not as efficient. They know their peers are also speakers, so therefore they rely on each other over time as they grow. Oh, that's great. That's a great point, Lisa. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, and that's perfectly relevant to what this right here, child to child. How much are they using the language in the language nest? And you're right, that's going to be the generation who grows up together, who can socialize and continue using the language. Great point. And again, right, this is you bring up that it doesn't have to be a westernized school setting, like the FPCC definition of a language nest, making it a home-like environment. The Mohawk language nest was also like that. It was very much a home, not like a westernized school setting. So let's see. When teachers, these language nests reported that when teachers spoke to other teachers, 100% of the time, they were using the native language. This language nest said that 80 to 90% of the time, they were using the native language. When teachers spoke to children, at the least 80, most commonly 100% of the time, they were using the language. However, when children spoke to teachers, the numbers switch, right? Here you have 80% of the older children, 80%. And they specified that the older children used the language 100% of the time when speaking to the teacher because they'd had more exposure. The younger children, it was more like 60 to 70% of the time. Here they said 90 to 100% of the time besides the new children who don't know it yet. This one it varied. This one they said 20% of the time the children spoke to the teacher in the language. And if you look at it here, these I don't have numbers for, but the language nests, and again, it's not anyone's fault, it's not a shortcoming, it's just sometimes the limitations of resources. Oh yes, okay, great. So the Lakota language nest in North Dakota requires parents to come and have weekly lessons to learn what their children were learning so that can be reinforced at the home. It is a requirement that parents pay at least partial tuition, not only to help with the funding, but also to keep parents and families invested literally. Yes, that's great. Do you work with the Lakota language nest? Lisa? I did interview the Lakota language nest. At the time, it was Mrs. Tipizu and Tolman Young, who was one of the teachers. And yeah, that's a great strategy, is to have parents pay tuition so they're invested literally and also emotionally, right? They're valuing what's offered. The Administration of Native Americans and some other language nest definitions, they also require the language nest to provide language lessons to the parents so that there's reinforcement in the home. So yeah, that's a great strategy. One language nest mentioned that they had difficulty doing that because they didn't have enough parents who were interested in bringing their children to the language nest. They were just trying to get people to participate. So trying to get people to participate and then requiring them to do language lessons, sometimes it was hard. So every community has a different situation, different challenges. Whereas in another location, the parent or the language nest had a long waiting list, and parents had to go through a rigorous application process and interviews, and they could only select a few because there was more demand than there were seats available. So yeah, in situations where the children use the language the least, the language nest was not operating as many hours per week. And in some cases, they were only operating maybe 2 days a week because they were just starting out or they didn't have enough funding. So when the language nest operated 2 days a week for maybe 4 hours each time, the children were not becoming fluent or producing in the language. Some studies suggest that in order for a child to produce or to speak in a language spontaneously, at least 20% of their total language exposure has to be in that language. And the more, the better, right? So the language nests that were open the most, had the most hours of operation and the most days per week and weeks per year, had children who were the most fluent. The amount of target language use from teachers self-reporting, do you think they might have intentionally skewed the numbers high at all? Because I'm sure it can be very hard. Yeah, that's very likely. Shirley makes a good point that the data might be skewed since it was self-reported. So it's probably not exactly 100%, right? So we take these as ballpark figures, and we can think of them as most of the time, not at all, and somewhere in between, right? Not much of the time, half of the time, most of the time. So you can think of it that way more generally, if that's helpful. But it still does. Oh yeah, Tippy, great. She's great. And I was Hidatsa, K-12 teacher. Oh, that's great. Wonderful, Lisa. Thank you for participating in this discussion. Oh, great, and you're going to start a language nest. Well, if I'm sure you've got the resources. If you want any of the resources people have shared with me, I'd be happy to share them. That goes for any of you who are watching or listening. So after the interviews, the challenges that people listed the most frequently to running a language nest, number one was families, interestingly. If the families weren't invested and they just saw it as a daycare or a babysitter, that was a problem if they just dropped off their kids and left. But if the parents really were passionate about language revitalization and they were taking language classes themselves and practicing with the children at home, the children did a lot better. And also if they showed appreciation to teachers and built a relationship with the teachers, it helped a lot. Finding qualified teachers, as we discussed, was challenging, and then funding was a challenge. Interestingly, factors of success, number one was also families. So families either make or break your program. The ones that, or the language nests that said they were doing really well, said it was because of the families being supportive and caring and being passionate and volunteering for fundraisers. So how involved the families are can kind of determine the success of the language nest. The cost was something we talked about, advice, and how the term language nest is used. I'll try to focus on the things. Anna and Shirley, am I supposed to stop at a certain time to have more time for dedicated just to question and answer? How long, how long do you want me to keep going? Okay. So, I'll go for a few more minutes then, and then we can have some dedicated question and answer time. And you're welcome, Lisa. So I'm guessing, I could be totally wrong. I haven't seen a number anywhere. And there are entire regions of the world, continents I don't know about with regard to languageness. Oh, okay. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, and if anyone needs to leave on the hour, totally understand. You can cut it short too. I can. So I'm guessing at the time, a couple of years ago, I was guessing that there are about 350 language nests in the world. There were about 200 in New Zealand. Kohangareo, that's a specific organization. They said there's a Punanareo organization that's outside of the Kohangareo government organization. And a few exist in those. There were 11 language nests in Finland, Inari Sami, Skolt Sami, and Northern Sami. 13 Hawaiian language nests, about 12 in British Columbia, many others scattered across the US and Europe. I sadly don't know the situation of language nests at all on the entire continent of Africa or Asia or Central South America. I did come across that one in Oaxaca that was no longer running. And there was one, a true Cushitic language nest in Taiwan that also was no longer operating by the time I did my dissertation. I believe there was an Okinawan, Uchinaguchi language nest in Okinawa. Oh, the Rai language nest in Nepal. Oh, wonderful. Okay. Wow, this is a great way to kind of collaborate with people around the world and find out what's going on in your region. So we don't know. Over here in Hawaii, we want to hear more about what's going on in Asia, in Africa, in South America. Haven't yet heard of a language nest in Africa? Yes, we would love to hear about it. And thank you, Raj Kumar. I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, but that's so exciting to find out about a language nest in Nepal. I'd love to learn more about it, actually. If any of you could contact me afterwards. I'll put my email address in here for any of you to contact me afterwards. I'd love to learn more from you about your language nests and find out more about the global situation. Oh, and this is a Inari Sami artist. She's indigenous Sami in Finland, and she uses traditional objects and themes to create modern art. So traditionally, Inari Sami would call themselves the reindeer people, and she did reindeer pelts in pixels. So creating the tradition, combining traditional and modern. Anyway, here, back to languages. Sorry, the new languages. Yeah. Oh, this is great. And you guys, can all use these platforms to connect with each other. Do you know what specific language net area in Okinawa that language nest was in? I don't know. I remember I took a language revitalization and acquisition class from William O'Grady and Kamal Dean at the University of Hawaii. And we had two guest speakers who were talking about Okinawan language revitalization. And I was never able to get a hold of them. One of them ended up stopping the language nest and continuing education, I think graduate school. So I'm not sure. I don't think it's currently operating. I don't know where it was. I might be able to find the name of the person. Thank you, Yumi, for your comment, your question. I'm sorry I don't have more information about that, but feel free to email me and we can try to see if we know some of the people who were involved. That was another challenge. They said in order for a language nest to succeed over time, it kind of requires people whose lives are committed to it. They kept saying over and over, this was a recurring thing. It's not just a job, it's a lifestyle and it's a life choice. And so if the main person who was running the language nest had other life things they needed to do, many times they'd need to stop to go to graduate school, and then they could come back and restart it. But when that one person with the vision and the drive and the motivation was gone, it often fell apart. Phone Pro Andes is practicing language lesson in Bolivia. Oh, great. Bolivian language lesson in Bolivia. Thank you, Achim. A bit off topic. Studies fears for any given language lesson. Oh, very cool. Yeah, actually, in Hawaii, the students who did Hawaiian language nests and immersion schools have higher rates of graduating from high school and attending higher education. They actually do better academically. So these are great questions and comments. I'd put hearts on all of these questions and comments, but I want to tie this up so I don't keep all of you too late. But I appreciate all of your input. Please keep contributing and sharing your thoughts. So one thing I discovered in my research was, as I talked to each language nest, they all kind of pointed to another language nest that influenced them. And Sami Ojibwe mentioned Maori, as did Hawaiian. And the Ojibwe, Wadukodading was the Ojibwe language nest they spoke with. They also mentioned Hawaiian. The Mohawk language nest mentioned Maori. The Lakota language nest mentioned the Mohawk language nest. And these are ones in British Columbia and this one in Kodiak Island in Alaska that mentioned each other. I'd heard in Finland they were saying they'd met with people who were trying to start an Ainu language nest. But I wasn't able to find out who or if it actually started. I apologize if I don't know how to pronounce your language. It's a severely endangered language in Central Australia. We are a year into our first master. Oh, wonderful. So, that's great. Yeah, that's a common way it happens is having a master apprentice program. That's how it happened in Finland. And then those master apprentice graduates go on to be language nest teachers. Oh yeah, venues. That's one thing I was going to talk about. We're running short on time, so I should probably just jump ahead to that. Do they need qualifications? Great, excellent questions coming from Vanessa. And these are all very practical, so I'm going to focus on that instead of the research side so much, although this was part of the research. So some people, actually I'm going to go here. Skip through all this, we can have the slides later. I say there are many ways to the top of the mountain. These are some of the needs and expenses. These are some solutions if you're short on funding. So do you buy, you rent? Some language nests were renting a space. The Kodiak Island was. The more established ones had their own space they owned. Another option is if anyone has vacant land that's owned, to have volunteers build a structure on it, a simple structure. Another option, so the way the Hawaiian language nest started out, right? They had no funding in the beginning. They just brought children to someone's home, whoever was willing. So if you don't have the average cost of running a language nest from the different ones I spoke to, don't be startled, don't let this scare you off, please, was $100,000 a year. That's a lot of money. But the Hawaiian language nest started out with no funding at all. So you can still start without money. You can start just watching them in someone's home. Eventually, most of them that lasted for the long term ended up by having their own structure built that they owned. How do they manage caring for their very young? The more teachers to children, the better. Some programs had teacher training programs that they needed to go through. In New Zealand, there are strict training programs. The British Columbia FPCC language nests also have training programs that teachers must go through in order to get funding. And the Language Nest Handbook discusses that, the link I included in the slides. Also, my dissertation describes some of that in more detail. And one problem was in one of the language nests, they were spending so much time taking the children to the bathroom, they didn't have time to teach them the language. So they had one person whose full-time job was to take little toddlers to the bathroom, and the other person who focused on the language. There was the reality, right, of cleaning up crumbs and all that. Bolivia language nest problem, great. Yeah, thank you for the link, Anna, there. It's also in the slides. Oh, great. A successful Blackfeet language immersion program. Well, hello, all of you. Vanessa, Lisa, Rodell. So really quick, I'm going to end, since we're running short on time, there's so much more we could talk about. And it costs about $100,000 a year for the very established ones. Here are funding, here are links in the slides to funding organizations. Jenny talked about some of these. Here are some more. These websites include an entire list of different places that fund language nests. Here are some other ones. The First Peoples Cultural Council in Canada has many grants, and Sami language nests get funded by the government and the Inari Sami Association. Many language nests charge tuition, and that's where they get most of their funding. And Sami language nests charge tuition on an income-based requirement. So parents that have not as much income don't have to. Oh, yeah, I'll tie this up. So I guess we will need to end now, but if you want a second one, we can. Sorry, this went on so long. But you can charge tuition based on the parent's income. And there's also a lot of fundraising, bake sales that the parents run so that they don't have to pay directly for activities. Also, many have the Hawaiian language nests will have parents come in and take turns cleaning the language nests so you don't have to pay for cleaning. They also have cooperation with food donation organizations that will collect foods from stores that are going to get rid of food that's about to expire, and they give them away. It's still safe, it's still good food, but they give it away free as a charity organization. So there's one on Oahu called, this is premature, Aloha Harvest. So Aloha Harvest will go around and collect food that's going to expire from different stores and then donate it to the language nests and to other organizations. So you can see if your area has, you could go to stores, grocery stores, and see if they donate food like that, and they could donate that to the language nest to feed the children. The Mohawk language nest also has a cooperative alliance with a Mohawk organization that grows their own food, and they share a lot of the food with the children. So it's all organic, no locally grown indigenous foods. So these are other ways to cut down on expenses. And I apologize that it was such a rush here, but please use these links, and they have lists to lots of other organizations and the details for how to apply for grants. And kia ora, mahalo, miigwech, gitu, taka, nyawin. Thank you everyone for coming. If you have any other questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Or if you have information about programs in your area, I'd love to learn that as well. Mutual aid would be good for that too. Great. Mutual aid. Is that an organization or? I could say more if any of you don't have questions. There's also a sample budget in the slides from the Maori language nest. They remained anonymous, but they're willing to share all of their expenses for a year. And you'd love to hear the entire, should I keep going? Okay. Or do you want me to do a second one? Anna, Shirley, what would you like me to do? Well, thank you. Thank you for participating. Let's see. Yeah, so that's kind of pretty much it. This language nest in New Zealand has a $71,000 profit every year. And so the Hawaiian language nests also have a profit, and they said they invest and save that. Okay, we'll do a second one sometime. But yeah, you can save and invest any money. Oh, Shirley says to keep going. Okay, so the Maori language nest makes a profit, a net profit, and the Hawaiian language nests do too, although they didn't share exact figures. They said they saved that money, they invested it very carefully so that they could use that to keep running the language nests. So the Mohawk Language Nest was funded. I'm not good at pronouncing Mohawk words, I apologize. But they had a settlement from a major corporation that sadly polluted their river, so they can no longer drink from it. So let's see. Sure. Okay, yeah. We can have a Q&A and do another session sometime. And then mutual aid is like Brittany says, it's like charity, but it's community-minded. Families, clean spaces. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Brittany. Yeah, that's kind of what the Hui Makua does, the parent organization at the Hawaiian Language Nest. Any other questions, comments? I guess we're out of time now. Yeah, and there were a lot of bake sales and things too, both at the Mohawk Language Nest and the Hawaiian Language Nest. And other fundraisers like races that people had to pay money to register for and do traditional, canoe paddling and running and such relays. And people would come from all over, and it would provide a lot of the funding for the Language Nest. It was like an annual event. So you can start an annual event in your area and have people apply and use that towards funding a Language Nest. Other questions, comments? Thank you, Anna. Sorry, it was a little rushed at the end there. I hope you guys have access to the slides later so you can use the links. Any other questions, comments? Okay, I guess not, unless there's a lag. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Shirley. Thank you, everyone who came to watch and participate. Should I end the video, or does anyone else have anything they'd like to add or share? Okay, thanks for posting the slides. Well, if no one has any more questions or comments, I'll end the video, and please feel free to email me. I'd love to hear more about your language situation. Thank you again for attending. Mahalo nui loa and a hui ho.